Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Ben Lavender is the Chief Product Officer of DAZN, the Netflix of sports and the first internet TV service. He has led the product from startup to build a 146-strong team in 10 countries in a business that now employs nearly 3,000 people and was the highest grossing sports app in the Apple App Store in 2019 with 140% year-on-year revenue growth. But Ben's story is so much more. Success with technology has been a consistent theme throughout his career. He is the creator of the BBC iPlayer before leading the design and development of LoveFilm's video streaming service from startup to acquisition by Amazon Video to form the foundation of Prime Video worldwide. But the story doesn't stop there. As well as having an incredible creative technical capability, he has a postgrad in counselling and psychotherapy. What's his story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Ben, first things first, what first growing up piqued your interest in technology?
So I guess that from a technical point of view, my favourite toy as a child was Lego. So I was always obsessed by building stuff. And then when I guess the BBC Micro came along, again, I was just tinkering around and just building stuff, just doing crude animations. And then invariably, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do for a degree, and it was a fairly sort of random thing that threw me into computer science. But I mean, I'd say it's more about building and using it as a means to an end. So I think Lego's got more to do with it than anything else.
Really, that's interesting, because having grown up, if I remember, look at the way that technology is in education now. I mean, certainly if I look at my computer room when I was a kid at school, I think we had half a dozen BBC A or maybe BBC B computers at that time. So off the back of kind of ZX81, ZX Spectrum and all that sort of world, building onto that.
Well, I was playing around with, I did have a ZX Spectrum, so I did used to play Hobbit and Manic Miner and Alien 8, as I remember. But yeah, I did get quite addicted to Elite on the BBC Micro.
But you would put it down partly that, as you say, it was building things and Lego that was integral to where you are now.
Using as a tool to build stuff. So I was more interested in what the code would let me do and the end result rather than the actual coding itself. Interesting.
So you as you point out, you study computer science at university. So how did you come to be working at the BBC?
I mean, in my early part of career, I worked for Walt Disney, or rather Buena Vista Home Entertainment, which was like the DVD distributors. I worked for MTV and I worked for Channel 5. And then at Channel 5, I end up by having a phone call from my ex-boss at Channel 5 saying, hey, do you want to come and join this startup? And it was before the time of broadband. And we were working with Quincy Jones and Dave Stewart in New York, working as what was called the Artist Network. And so our aim was to deliver them their mate's black book of videos and songs over the internet, and do so as a sort of B2B service. So at that time, Peter Gabriel had already set up a competitor service, which was just creating white label download services of kind of like music. So probably about 18 months into the project, my CEO and I were flying over to New York on September the 11th. And on our way to the airport, we found out that our flights had been grounded and the Twin Towers had just collapsed. At the same time, part of Artist Network's funding was Deutsche Bank, and they happened to be based in the Twin Towers. And so after that, there was less enthusiasm for our venture, and so I decided to take refuge. And before Mode imploded, I joined the BBC. So
I'm trying to get my head around timescales. I'm just thinking back in terms of my life. I love music. So I remember it's got to have been at least 15, if not 20 years ago when I think probably 15 years maybe would have gotten my first iPod. But I seem to remember spending hours and hours and hours loading my CD collection up onto a laptop from which I could then subsequently play through iTunes. So, I mean, you're talking sort of late 90s, early noughties?
This is pre-iTunes. So, yeah. I mean, at the time, I think I had a Creative Revo and there were a bunch of other sort of really small different sort of apps and devices where you could just rip CDs and copy the MP3s onto a device. And there was obviously Napster was wild.
Napster, that's the one I could.
So everyone was literally just downloading MP3s like crazy. So that's. I mean, my first year was spent doing things like I worked on something called CelebDAC, which was a celebrity stock market, which won a BAFTA. Worked on Children in Need for the donation systems, GCSE Bite Size. But after I'd been in there for a year, I came up with the idea for something else.
Interesting. But I even think if I go back to the whole concept of where streaming services were going to be originating from, was it really more of a piracy initially, particularly in music? If I go back to my own childhood, I'm certainly of a generation where recording the top 40 on a Sunday afternoon via, from a cassette deck over the radio, not even connected, arguably, oftentimes to the output source. There's always been a kind of an issue, I guess, a feature of life where people would look to acquire content in some way, shape, or form, but it would have still been very much in its infancy, I guess, in the early noughties. It was.
I mean, that's basically where it came from. So, being brutally honest, like for me, so I had this idea while I was at the BBC. I was going through a divorce. And I had a lot of time on my hands. I'd actually been staying with a mate of mine in New York. And then I got quite addicted to Buffy the Vampire Slayer and while I was in New York. And then when I came back, there was a 6 months holdback. And so speaking to my friend Laurie about what was going on, she said, oh, yeah, you should just download it on BitTorrent. So I started downloading all these episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer on illegally over the internet. And after a while I'd been doing this, I thought, yeah, this is a bit naughty. I probably shouldn't be doing this. And B, I'm sure there's a ways to make a legitimate service. And so over, I think what was around the year 2000 or something like that, I wrote over Christmas because I was kind of in my parents' basement, like spending a lot of time on my own. So I got this eureka moment for the idea of a catch-up TV service where you could go backwards for the last 7 days. And originally, it was going to be all public service broadcasters all in one place. And then when I got back to the BBC in January, I started trying to get some enthusiasm for the idea. The first person I spoke to was the head of strategy at the time, who told me I was an idiot. I was wasting my time. The BBC's job was to provide program support material on the website, and no one would be interested in watching TV on a computer. At that point, that was my presentation number one. I didn't give up. I managed to twist somebody's arm to give me 12 grand to make a promo video. And off the back of that, I started doing a roadshow around the BBC. Everyone, again, the amount of resistance to this idea, you would not believe, is because everyone thought it would never work. No one would want it. People kept on telling me, what is the point of this? You've got a TV, you can just see. You can see the television if you want. Why would you need it on your phone? Why would you need it on the web? They just didn't understand. And so I carried on. And eventually, people used to give me so much negative feedback why it was a terrible idea. So I used to write down all their questions about why it was a bad idea, why it would never work. And then I'd work out answers for actually why it was a good idea. And eventually, after 84 presentations, which does sound a bit bonkers, but it was literally 84 presentations. And then eventually I got in front of the executive board under Greg Dyke. And I was actually really nervous that I was going ahead. I stayed the night. It was in Norwich. It was in Norwich City Stadium. And they were being served delicious food by Delia Smith, the BBC execs. And then I think in the morning I was spending an hour doing Tai Chi just to get myself in a Zen moment so I could be on my best. And then I showed my pitch video, went through the pitch deck, and then they erupted. Greg Dyke stood up saying, "You've saved the BBC." Alan Yentob called me a genius, and they're all basically sort of yeeps and rounds of applause. And off the back of that, they gave me 250 grand to run a technical trial. So I ran a technical trial which had about 1,000 users, and it went for about 3 months, and the results of which were incredibly positive. And I thought, great, let's get this thing live. And then after that, they said, well, actually, no, we want some more data. So they gave me £2.5 million to run a wider content trial. I think we had 3,000 users and a lot more content, as opposed to we'd actually have sort of series catch up. So again, the results of that were very positive. During that time, we had a change of DG. I think DG, Greg, fell out with number 10, and so he left the BBC. And he was replaced by Mark Thompson. And Mark Thompson was at the TV festival and announced that the BBC was going to put, at the working title, was My BBC Player Through a Public Value Test. Now, that was basically meant that for about 18 months, it couldn't be released. Now, the BBC was very concerned about competition, so much concerned about competition, I was asked to go and present the prototype to Sky. When I did that, they basically nicked some of my developers and created what was then Sky by Broadband and turned into Sky Go. And then I was also asked to show it to Channel 4 for the very, very same reason. And then they stole some of my developers as well and launched what was then called 4OD, but was then again rebranded. So it was, for me personally, it was quite frustrating, the fact it was putting the brakes on, and it wasn't necessarily the first to the market, when in actual fact it was. And so by the time it eventually got released, it was a huge success, and I think it peaked was about taking about a third of the UK's internet.
Well, I mean, it's a fabulous story. But if you go back first, two things that spring to mind. But first and foremost, 84. I think you mentioned 84 presentations. 84 presentations, which
I wrote them down in a log.
You must have been convinced that it was, as to the viability of your proposition. Yeah. But where did that drive come from? Where did that belief come from?
I don't give up easily.
Clearly.
I think a former manager at the BBC referred to me as a bit of a terrier. I just don't give up. So I just carried on. I just knew it was a great idea, and I couldn't believe. I thought eventually sanity will prevail, and I just carried on and on.
And had that been an inherent part of who you are growing up, if you reflect back, had you always been the kind of individual with that degree of tenacity?
To, I guess, a certain extent. I mean, I guess you could probably say about my Tai Chi. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm the most naturally gifted in terms of dancing or doing things physically, but I probably start out a bit uncoordinated, but I guess what I do have is determination. So I will just keep going and keep carrying on, and eventually I'll get there. I mean, I have an inherent view that I could more or less do anything, and it's if I set my mind to it. Once I've set my mind to it, it just becomes, if it's my passion and I want to do it, I will literally just move heaven and earth. I mean, some of the time when I was working on iPlayer, like even working on promo videos, I'd be working to like 3 a.m, and it's not. I was only doing that because I was really enjoying what I was doing. I mean, I was knackered. But
what did you enjoy about the experience? What did you enjoy about it?
I mean, I guess that when I made some of the promos, because ultimately what I got is that in the BBC is that I figured the way to communicate to people is through video, because they didn't understand the concept. And so I made a video to explain how, imagine what this life would look like. And when I was doing that, then it allowed even me to see, oh, well, actually, yeah, this could look really exciting. In fact, one thing I didn't mention is, again, to try and get people excited for the Execo members. This was before the iPad, and there was something called an HP iPack, which was about this kind of size. And what I did is that I did some profiling all of the Execo members. I found out what kind of programs they'd be interested in. And I got hold of that content from the BBC archive. I encoded it and sideloaded it onto all of these devices. And so I found out what Greg's football team was.
Is it Blackburn Rovers? Does that ring a bell? I think it is. I'm getting my B's confused.
Say it's not that, but I mean, let's call it that for the sake of an argument. I basically put it onto this iPad and gave it to him. And he said, imagine if you just missed a goal, but you can watch it on, the working title was IMP, the Integrated Media Player.
Goodness.
So, and then that they got it.
So in terms of the sort of objections that were being raised within the BBC that meant that you had to go through those 84 meetings in order that you might make this happen, and we'll come on to the success you enjoyed in due course. But I guess it strikes me, and again, I'm wrapping my head around timeframes, but clearly the concept of, we grew up with video recorders. So the idea that you could not watch something in real time, but that you could record it and play it back was not of itself a new concept. I'm just trying to understand what it was about the proposition, because when you describe it now, and maybe that's because the way the world has evolved and technology's evolved, it almost seems incomprehensible that anyone would suggest it would be a daft idea. But actually at the time, I'm trying to think as to what sort of objections may have been raised and that you would have had to have overcome.
Well, I think if you look through, you need to look through the lens of what there was at the time. I mean, at the time, things like streaming was the size of a postage stamp. It wasn't reliable, and there's pretty much just downloads. Also, at the time, there was live television which you could just turn on. You could record stuff, and so a lot of the people I was speaking to saying, "We've already got this. Why do you need anything else?" It just didn't understand. They thought that people wouldn't want it. They thought that technology just wouldn't work. They thought there would be problems with the license fee. Thought there'd be problems with the competition. They thought that we'd never be able to persuade rights holders. I mean, what I had to do as well during this, the actual technology bit was the easy bit.
Yeah,
I had to convince our, I guess, Director of Rights and Business Affairs, Sarah Gator, who's now at Talkback, lovely lady, and she got it. And frankly, without her, it would be dead as a doornail. But she got it, and then basically on the back of that, of her getting it, then I had to go and do loads of presentations to rights holders, because what we had to do, we had to rewrite every single rights contract going forward. So initially, at the beginning, the rights didn't allow us to have the rights on iPlayer. So we had to rewrite and pay a percentage fee to the rights holders on the new contracts going forward. So it was a huge exercise just to actually get rights holders' heads around it and to do all the contracts.
So you were clear in your own mind. You knew the technology would work. The technology would support what you were trying to achieve. It's more of a...
I've been working on that technology mode before I was at the BBC, so I was familiar with it.
Interesting. So take me back to Norwich City, Carrow Road, Norwich City Football Club. You've just been given the green light. You've saved the BBC, I think, in the words of Greg Dyke or Alan Yentobel, Greg Dyke. Can you remember the emotions? Can you remember how you felt at that moment?
I could definitely feel the endorphins pumping and sort of the tingles of something sort of tingling on my spine. But yeah, I was pretty pumped, and I mean it was quite a thing to see a bunch of the executive committee, who I guess the thousands of people at the BBC would be looking up to, all laughing and jumping and giggling, and it's just like, wow, seemed to be at the right idea at the right time.
And can you remember again then moving forward from there, the sort of the launch moment, the switch on moment? Was there a moment where the product becomes live, BBC iPlayer is launched, available to the wider public, and again how you felt at that point?
Well, it's fair to say that even when that enthusiasm from the executive committee, even when I was running the 2 technical trials, there was still a lot of deep suspicion or skepticism that it was still going to be a silly idea. So it was when we were into the public value test, then eventually it became almost like the biggest project in the BBC, and then everyone wanted a piece of it. And so initially, I was running on like a bit of a small skunk works team, and people kind of like left us alone. And then suddenly it became the biggest thing in the BBC, and it's like everyone wanted to be involved. So as a personal perspective, it wasn't quite that much fun anymore. And so for me personally, after about 4.5 years of pushing this thing forward, I kind of really was ready to do something else. And then I got a phone call from a headhunter about doing something for Love Film, And so I decided it was time for me to move on, literally just about time of it going live.
Which I would imagine the BBC would be very reluctant to let you go. Your stock would have been very high. You've saved the BBC. Back to that phrase again. It must have been was it a wrench to leave? And what perhaps might have been the appeal of Love Film?
It was a bit of a wrench. I mean, I was really umming and ahhing whether I would go, but I just after a while I just wanted to do something new. And I mean, the BBC's got huge resources available, but it is in some ways it can be a bit slow. And initially, when I joined Love Film, I had a tiny team, and there was just wasn't a lot of money. It was a startup
when you joined, right?
It was a startup, and it was only later when we joined at Love Film that Love Film took ownership. Because initially it was DVD rental. It was a copy of what Netflix was doing in the US, and eventually Amazon was doing DVD rental as well by post.
By post, right?
By post, and they'd had enough of that business. They wanted to exit that, so they had an arrangement with Love Film to buy that business, and as part of that, they took a minority shareholding in Love Film, and they were a fairly had a board member, but they were fairly passive. But after a while, then what I was principally hired to do is create their video on demand service. So I did that on the web, and then we launched on PlayStation 3 and Samsung and LG TVs, etc., and mobile. And after a while, they started to wake up, and then I guess the VCs behind Love Film, frankly, they wanted an exit. What they put their money into was a DVD by post, and they I guess they wanted to exit that. Whereas Amazon was very hungry to start building what's now become sort of Amazon Prime Video. So then they started pumping a lot of money into for us to acquire content, because Love Film's content at the time initially was terrible. So we started to be able to buy some big movies and big TV series, and it really we were quite worried about Netflix coming to the UK. So we were working away, and eventually Amazon said, well, actually we're going to we'd like you to start working on building TV apps for Prime Video, and then eventually we were fully absorbed into Amazon, and so basically Prime Video is pretty much built on the foundations of Love Film. The TV apps and the web it's the core. A lot of the Love Film staff are still there today.
What do you think you learned from that Love Film experience? You've gone from to your point, the resources that would have been available to you at somewhere like the BBC to a startup. Admittedly, I think you mentioned venture capital backed. You've got some Amazon involvement, so you've got some investment, some capital available, but nonetheless, it's a very different dynamic to the BBC.
Yep.
How did you find the transition?
I enjoyed it. I mean, it was more KPI driven. I mean, it was more hand to mouth. I mean, ultimately, it was very commercial, very marketing driven, and it was very much about doing the next ad campaign just to try and grow the subscriber base. So there were regular town halls to the whole company about where we were in terms of from our subscriber base, and so we just kept growing. So it was fun. But we didn't have a lot of money to start off with. The core was on DVD rental, and eventually then it flipped the other way, and the streaming service was starting to take over, and it did. And obviously the DVD by post has now there's no more.
Yeah, absolutely. You'd obviously seen the direction of travel for some time. You'd recognised that streaming was, in whatever way, shape or form that may have taken, but going right back to music, it was going to be, streaming content was going to be what the future looked like, the way that was then all of a sudden going to become an integral part of all of our lives.
That's what I was thinking. I mean, even when I was at Channel 5, and this is before broadband, and this was even before Mode, I'd actually started doing some streaming there. So Channel 5 was a curious place. I mean, I was working on something called Jailbreak. Jailbreak was Channel 5's rip-off of Big Brother, where as opposed to filming people within an enclosure, and then they're voted out, the people actually had to try and escape from a prison. But once people escaped, then people just got a bit bored. So I was doing live streaming of that, and then I did live streaming of a Barbarians rugby match. But that was about it. It wasn't the most exciting thing in the world, but it at least gave me a taste of what the future might hold.
And if you look at Amazon's involvement, I think I'm not suggesting for 1 minute I coined this particular phrase, but I'm convinced that Amazonification, if there were to be such a word, will come to describe so much of what we've seen within the world in which we exist today. I mean, it's a giant. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but I think as last I read it, as of July, 1 million employees worldwide. But it wasn't always quite the scale and size that it is now. I always love that picture of I think it's Jeff Bezos in a room in 1997, with a sort of hand-painted banner of Amazon. You look at what it's become today; it's phenomenal. But what did you learn from from working at Amazon, do you think?
I think my time at Amazon was probably my most formative time in terms of product management. I can't say it was necessarily always an easy ride. It's definitely not an easy ride. What you effectively learn is really about very customer-focused, data-driven product management. So when you make decisions, you have to make sure you can justify them with data. You have to be laser focused on customer metrics. So when you've shipped a feature, you need to actually be looking at the success metrics, A/B testing that against a previous version, and always basically on it. And in terms of when you're thinking through a view about a new feature which you might build, you write one of these, effectively a working backwards document, which is something that I've continued to use in DAZN. So what you do is basically a 6-page document with a bunch of appendices. The first page is a press release. So you imagine in 6 months' time, say if you're going to launch a feature, you write the press release as if it was 6 months' time. So it's got to really feel real. And then within that, you can think of that like an executive summary, but it should feel like a real press release about this new project or product you're going to launch. And then within about 2 or 3 pages, you write a set of customer-facing questions. So what are the kind of questions like, how much does it cost? Where can I find it? What content's available? What platforms is it on? Blah. You just keep going. And then a set of 2 or 3 pages of internal business-facing questions. So what are the kind of questions which, like the legal team, the operations, marketing, commercial, how's this going to make any money? What's the unique point of difference, etc. And it basically becomes this Bible which anyone else in the project you can show it to, and they have clarity and alignment, and you're thinking forwards in a very customer-facing way of what is this product you want to build. And then when you have this vision, and then off the back of that, then you start building. Yeah, off the back of that, then we'd be doing use cases and a bunch of Jira tickets from our backlog, which we ruthlessly prioritized in terms of P1, P2, P3. P1 you cannot ship without it. P2 you will aim to ship with it, and if you don't ship with it, it'll be a failure, but it will launch without it. P3 is a nice to have, and P4 you're just not going to do. So that's how I continue to prioritize today in terms of a very data-driven way of doing product management has shaped me from ever after.
And do you think that that's what you might attribute to Amazon's success?
Definitely.
On a more, in a more global scale, that they start with the customer, work back from the customer, but then are relentless in their commitment to and rigor around data and what that can impart, and absolutely then execution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is I think the best thing that I learned was working backwards and sort of data driven, and just really being very focused and always asking why. So if somebody's saying, I'd like to do this feature or this new service, why? Have you got what basis do you have to think about and question? And so that really changed me. And so and just really thinking about metrics. So I learned enormously. I have to say, it's quite a challenging environment. It's not necessary for everyone. To a certain extent, you might, I guess, in the early days of Amazon Prime, I mean, there was a lot of money being spent on content, and there was I think it was probably one of the areas that Jeff Bezos was looking at most. There was a lot of pressure. So, I mean, I think there's been some challenging articles written about life at Amazon. One was in the New York Times which was saying Amazon wrestling big ideas and bruising workplace. Yeah, sometimes it could be bruising. And I think after about 4.5 years, I was ready to do something different.
How much does that focus around data and therefore presentation of a compelling case, a data-driven decision, if you like, impact creativity? If you have someone come to you with an idea, if you go back to your BBC iPlayer creative experience, you had a absolute conviction it would work.
Yep.
And over time, arguably, you were then given the money to then research and present the business case, if you like, for the investment. But initially, that was just about having an idea. Had someone at that point have challenged you why, other than that unswerving belief to make it happen? I guess, does Amazon stifle that creativity? Is that a fair accusation? Or how does it balance off the need for that creative capability in order that the business can continue to flourish with a need for data to drive decision?
That's a very good question. And I'd say that you still need creativity. And the two things are not mutually exclusive. I guess that the Amazon way of, at least, I guess what I would say, if you have a great idea, you'd still need to be putting it through usability testing, ethnographic research to actually, you have a good idea, but you actually, you test it out and you actually make sure it's going to work. I mean, ultimately, I don't think, if you think about some of the inventions from Apple, I don't think the iPhone would have been designed by a committee, or even just some of the joyful things that come out of Apple, like the bounce, even just like when you're moving, you get at the bottom of your contacts, you just move it and it just bounces up. It's just beautiful. It's just effortless. That is not really data that's made that decision. It's really an instinctive call. So you still need to have that. You still need great creatives to come up with something that's visionary. But it's trying to balance that of, it's not all gut feel. So, I think it's fair to say, Amazon executes brilliantly. I think some of what they do can be a tendency to, obviously they A/B test and multivariant test everything. So some of what it can be is just evolutions of what they've got before, which you can certainly say looking at the Amazon website, because it hasn't changed dramatically from when it first launched. And it's not necessarily the most consistent. But the way that Amazon does run, it runs like a massive startup, or a collection or federation of lots of little startups. So you don't necessarily have tons of resources at your disposal. If you actually add it all up together, it does. But within your specific division, you're just like a little startup. And that's the way Jeff likes it.
And do you think, how much of that was, if you move on from Amazon, you join DAZN, which is, as I understand it, describes itself as the Netflix of sports, or has been described as the Netflix of sports. I think when you joined in 2015, am I right in saying you're employee number 6?
It was incubated in Perform Group. So when I joined, it was effectively, so I joined the Perform OTT division under the project working title of about live sport. So I think there's maybe about 300, 400 people within Perform Group who were working on things like goal.com, sporting news, and a bunch of other portals, and also Opta Data. And they did do some B2B production, and also things like Watch and Bet, which was providing video services to the betting industry. But the actual business itself, I think there was only initially it was about 6 people in a room of working, trying to get this idea off the ground.
So where do you start? Because since then, I think you yourself have built a team of 146 in a business that employs the best part of not far shy of, I think, 3,000 people.
Something like that, yeah.
Tell me about the journey. Where did you start?
Ultimately, when I came on board, I was told, right, we want to launch in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and Japan, and make it happen. So I joined in 2015. We wanted to launch in 2016, and we wanted to get this thing live as quickly as possible. So I was involved basically even before I'd actually come on board on the tender process, working with different suppliers. I was flying over to New York to go and meet MLBAM, which was Major League Baseball's advanced development unit, which was actually bought up by Disney, which created Disney Plus. So we were speaking to them. We were speaking to a bunch of other partners about the idea of being able to help work with us to try and a bunch of best of breed suppliers to try and get something together to get live. Now, So I did that, and at the same time, I managed to assemble sort of a crack team. Initially, sort of, I think there's probably a product team of around 6 or 7. I stole liberally from the BBC and from Amazon of people that I knew had done this before. In fact, one of the guys who's working on this still with us, a guy called Mark Hewis. I've been working with him now for about 18 years. So he worked with me on iPlayer, Love Film, Amazon, and DAZN. So there was quite a few of the sort of Love Film guys came on board, and I think after a while, I think it's probably about 13 people from BBC iPlayer, something like that. 20 people from Amazon eventually ended up joining us. So I wanted people effectively, before I'd actually gone into it. I mean, I'd done a couple of streaming services before, but I didn't realize sport was going to be so hard, because sport has a lot more that you don't think about. Because if you are getting buffering and you're watching a match, if you've missed a goal, fans go utterly ballistic. So it's just got to work. Imagine. Also, if a fan sees on Twitter there's been a goal, before they see that on screen, they also go berserk. If you can't see the number on a shirt, fans go crazy. If the picture quality is not good enough, if the ball is going fast and you start seeing it's juddering, so the frames per second are not good enough, again they go crazy. They're very emotional, so much more so than you have, say, with the likes of Netflix. Or it's the passion. It's not that they like watching sport, it's their religion. It's just that the difference is just like night and day. And so the fact is, when it's live, the likelihood of things going wrong is so much greater. I mean, for Netflix, they shoot their content, put it in the can, encode it, and then they can put it all the way on the network, and it generally works. It's live. You think about any break in the chain from the stadium to your screen, any break in that chain means fans don't get sport.
And much of which is outside of your control, I would imagine, or some of which at least.
Some of which is outside control. I mean, the thing is, DAZN now, things like the J League, Champions League now. I mean, we're in Germany, like we're host broadcaster, so we'll be shooting that, like we're producing the whole thing end to end. But yeah, we do acquire some content, like things like sort of NFL, Premier League, and so yeah, we are dependent upon third-party productions.
So, I mean, we have globally, a voracious appetite for sport, acquiring sports content, and to your point, the passion that exists around it. It's and it only appears to be going in one direction. I mean, clearly, the impact of the pandemic and the fact that we've not had a lot of sport had been at least delayed, now back on our screens, but not with fans in stadiums. That obviously there are steps underway currently to start to address that, but it's going to be quite some time, I think, before we're going to see full stadium, certainly around the world.
Yeah.
But the direction of travel for sport, I mean, it strikes me that the market is only just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Certainly the investment that's going into acquiring rights to deliver content, that market is explosive.
It is, absolutely. And that's what DAZN is seeking to sort of ride that wave. I mean, we're now the although we're not a name in the UK, we are the highest grossing sports app in the world, above ESPN, NFL Game Pass. So DAZN is coming at some point globally, but in fact we were ready to launch globally, but a little pandemic got in the way.
Absolutely. So what are the technologies that, if you relate specifically to your DAZN responsibilities, first and foremost, what are the technologies that you're really excited by?
I mean, initially, what we focused on is making sure, I mean, what I like to say, if content is king, distribution is queen. So you can basically watch it anywhere. And so we've managed to get onto, I think we're on more devices now than Amazon Prime. And we did so in about 18 months, which that is no mean feat. And we did that on a much smaller tech team. So that is something I'm proud of. In terms of some of the technology that's in the future that's coming that I'm excited by. I mean, it's everything from using data. We have really rich data from Opta. So DAZN used to own Opta, which now we've basically sold that off in terms of Stats Perform, which we still have a stake in. Now, there's a rich data set in terms of where players are on the pitch, what particular parts, when they see red cards, yellow cards, goals, shots on target, or etc. How you use that data and using that in meaningful ways to actually tell stories. Because if it's just stats, it's just not interesting. But if you actually how you use that to sort of like engage with people, particularly where we've got a feature which we're working on at the moment, which is looking at, because when there's a multitude of content on, what's exciting that we can actually tell you about now, so you can feel like the pulse of what's going on. Also, we've been doing some R&D in terms of virtual reality and augmented reality, which is pretty exciting. Now, on a podcast, it's difficult to kind of like do it justice, but I will at least try. But in terms of boxing, then if you ever seen the making of The Hobbit, where you see the Andy Serkis, who's covered in this suit with lots of black dots all over us, and as he moves his arms around, then they're able to actually capture his movement. So we've done something similar, but without having to wear dots. So what's called markerless motion capture, and at the same time, we've done full body scanning of boxers. And so what that effectively you can do is that we can stream the full 3D render of basically sports players, overlay their skin, and that basically means that you can see the action from any angle, and it looks awesome. So when Anthony Joshua is doing his knockout punch, you can see it from his eyes. I mean, it blows your mind. And
my goodness.
So that's exciting. And I mean, personally, I'm actually quite excited about just even other technologies. I mean, like my son's obsessed by Fortnite, and just even looking at some of the online events, like sort of like Travis Scott. I mean, the online audience for Fortnite is about 350 million, which is like mind blowing. I mean, that's bigger than the US. I think, is that bigger than Russia? I don't know. It's not quite as big as China, but it's like a country. It's like a continent. And then Travis Scott did a live gig event in Fortnite and got 12 million users. I mean, that of a virtual event. But I think that how virtual events might pan out, and especially with an annex of sport, could be quite interesting.
Is 5G the game changer that we're led to believe it may be? I guess if I'm thinking in terms of how we're streaming content, for example, on smaller and smaller devices, handheld devices in particular, does 5G really then change the game again?
5G will certainly give you a lot more bandwidth. I mean, what that basically means is that you could be doing production, you could be live production over just a 5G. So, I mean, for us, it means that you can get access to, from the production angle, you can get access to a lot more content, because you don't have to necessarily get a satellite or lay fiber. So, I mean, at the moment, YouTube means that people can like broadcast from anywhere. But if you're live streaming off your phone, it's not necessarily going to be super reliable. But if you're live streaming over 5G, then you get very high quality. And from a customer point of view, yes, it means that you can be getting UHD on your phone. Obviously, phone's not particularly big, so you might not necessarily notice the difference. But if you're using an iPad, or you're using more data to, there are using 3D and actually, if you think back to the Matrix. And when bullet time, when Keanu Reeves, when there's bullets coming in, and you see the multiple cameras, it's sort of step changes around. The NFL have been working with Intel, some similar kind of technology. Now, if you can, like, whether you're doing that, then the need to be able, when you're streaming a video that's got multiple different angles that you can navigate to, then you need more bandwidth. And then that becomes even more exciting, because you can get much more immersive experiences. And particularly in the post-COVID world, where more people are consuming remotely, the more immersive and engaging you can make it, the better. So
tell me, what about away from work, Ben? Because you've got an incredible responsibility with DAZN. The pace and change of innovation constantly is placing intellectual demands, if for want of a better expression, on you, and looking at how that impacts the responsibilities you enjoy at work. What do you do to unwind? How do you you mentioned Tai Chi earlier, for example. How do you escape? How do you get away from it all? Do you get away from it all?
I mean, for me personally, I mean, I meditate. I mean, I did probably about the time for when I was getting iPlayer off the ground. I was actually training as a psychotherapist, and I studied that for 3 years. So, I mean, at the time when I was getting iPlayer off the ground, I was training as a psychotherapist. I was training as a PADI dive master. I was also training for the London Triathlon. I was doing a bit much, but while I was training as a psychotherapist, I studied lots of different methods of I guess helping people recover. One of which was meditation, which is something that stuck. I've been doing Tai Chi on and off, and I think that generally I find that if I can get out of my emotional state and be more rational and calm, then life is just easier. So I do encourage that. In fact, certainly at DAZN, I run a weekly meditation class.
That of itself must be a challenge, because the thing I think that strikes us there's so much noise now. You know, if you look at the multitude of channels of communication and the information that we acquire and consume as a consequence on a daily basis, just simply going about our lives, it strikes me that to quieten the noise is an enormous challenge for many.
Yeah.
So that practice around meditation must, I would imagine from what you're saying, it's something you find to be of real value.
Absolutely. I mean, basically, there's so many voices that can come into your head. If your mind is not clear, then you could be maybe having about 30,000 thoughts a day. Now, not all of those are positive, and quite a lot of those are negative, thinking that I shouldn't have done that. You may be thinking about what may or may not happen tomorrow, what you might have said, what you wish you'd said, what they're wearing, I mean, it's just that if I find that meditating is that your mind is quiet. It feels almost like that before I've meditated, then almost like my mind is a messy room, and as I'm walking around the room, I'll just fall over, and if I can just reorder my room, it's calmer, it's just easier, and then it's not like you don't think. I mean, some people will say that, why would I want to meditate? I want to think. I mean, I still think, but I mean, generally, I find that some of my best thoughts come from my subconscious. So even like BBC iPlayer, it came to me literally. I'd had a dream, and it just basically came to me first thing in the morning. And generally, I find that my best thoughts, often best ideas, I'll sleep on it, and then the idea will just pop into my head in the morning. And it's just I need. So I can still kind of get that, but it's easier if I have a clear head.
Do you think that's interesting? I've read a lot of late, just from not in terms of any detailed analysis, but just more from a commentary perspective, about the fact that the lack of boredom, if I can put it in those terms. So we have a whole host of distractions that are consistently available to us. So rarely these days do you see someone, for example, sat not at least looking at something somewhere, whether that's a device of some description, scrolling a phone, social media, news, whatever it might be, but that there was that sense as to what impact the fact that we have all of these distractions would have on creativity. Some of the very best of ideas will come from being bored. You know, people just being bored and entertaining themselves and thinking up ideas. Kids, for example, just playing and being very, very creative. Now we give them things to distract them. Actually, you know, having grown up, you know, the old argument around climbing trees and playing in fields, there's a huge amount of creative energy that stems from that. To your point, some of your very best ideas come from a dream, from your subconscious.
Yeah.
Do you think there's how we get back to that? I don't know quite what the answer is, but I do. It does concern me somewhat that we don't have the opportunity to be bored anymore.
I
and there's
completely
some good that can come from being bored.
I think you need. It's really difficult to try and innovate unless you can actually allow some time for like free thought and not without judgment. I mean, boredom frankly really helps. I mean, iPlayer came to me when I was really bored. I was just kicking around a few ideas, and then boom, it came as a fully formed idea, and I just had to just write it down because it was there.
It strikes me we don't place the same stock on and value on thinking, more so on doing. So as an example, I always remember a conversation I had many years ago with a chap who's a CEO, and he actually, we were just chatting, and he said to me, would you ever read a book at your desk in the office? And I said, absolutely not. He said, well, let me put it another way. Would you ever read a book at your desk in the office if the content of that book was having a very positive impact on what it was that you were doing in the course of your working day, in the course of your job, or what you were trying to achieve? Still no. Well, he said, well, you do read though? Yeah, I read a lot. Or when do you read? In my own time, weekends, evenings, whatever. So why would you never, if it's work related, why would you never read it at work? Because people would see me reading a book at my desk and think he's not doing anything. And there is that sense that, there's not the same. Once upon a time, people would have thought he's reading, he's a great intellect, he's a thinker. And there would be a real virtue in it. I would have been called something. But now we place stock on doing and being busy, and actually not the same degree of on that time around thinking. You need to be seen to be doing something. And it strikes me that that's a dangerous course, because we lose that innovation and ideas and creativity that's such an integral part of our lives.
I completely agree. As I said, my best toy I had as a child was Lego. And really, it was at my parents' house. It was basically a wooden drawer that just had a whole bunch of Lego. And it wasn't really the fact of having lots of different sets. It was the fact of just having these bricks and just creating stuff. And a lot of it was just boredom and fiddling and just creating stuff. That's really what got me into development or product management. Frankly, it was all Lego.
It's interesting. It's really. What do you think you got out of the? You go back to that counselling and psychotherapy study. What do you think that equipped you with?
I think the biggest thing I got out of it is self-awareness. I mean, I think what I was more aware before then about how necessary I was feeling, about with less empathy or less understanding or awareness about how, depending upon how I was behaving or how potentially situations, I guess it gave me, greater insight to actually try and to read a situation, read how people are behaving, and to try and think as to why, or even if people are in a bad mood, doesn't necessarily mean it's about you. Could be, but because it's a variety of reasons as to about how people are feeling. And I guess it was the greater sense of awareness. I guess what I found from the counseling side is that although it means it gives you greater awareness, it doesn't necessarily allow you to deal with actually how you're feeling. And that's how I say what I get from meditation and Tai Chi, even more so.
Interesting. So what's the one piece of advice that you would give to any aspiring person out there with an idea?
Well, I think that it's an old maxim that you just have to not give up. And it's the old maxim is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. I mean, ideas, you can come up with tons of ideas. There's loads of ideas I've come up like doing books or whatever, or coming up with some apps, but you've just got to stick with it. If you have a great vision, and if it really is a good idea, you just got to keep going. And that's mainly what it's about. It's about persistence. It's not giving up. And even if it's looking really desperate, you've got to keep going.
And this has been a consistent theme through this podcast series, actually, that sense that we live in a world where there is an expectation of an immediacy of result, an immediacy of success, perpetuated oftentimes by much of what we see on social media.
Yeah.
But that actually, if you look at most, there is almost arguably no such thing as an overnight success. There are a few exceptions, undeniably. I'm sure we could think of them, but for most, it is absolutely about persistence before you start to get anywhere near the kind of level of success that you might hope for or might expect.
I mean, I think there's a book I'm reading at the moment by a guy called Josh Waitzkin. It's called The Art of Learning. It's fascinating. And you may have heard of a film and book called The Search for Bobby Fischer, where he was a childhood chess prodigy who I think age 6 or 8 won national championships. And when he in the sort of later teens, he won like adult world championships. He was incredible. And then he talks later about he then actually went into Tai Chi and became a professional Tai Chi push hands world champion. And now he's become a surfing champion. Now, what he talks about in the book is about how he learns. And it's really about breaking an activity down into small chunks, breaking it into chunks and really focusing on mastering that small bit. And also, like if you're learning to dance, you literally just work on the first couple of steps. And you don't move on until you've actually completely mastered that. And then each thereafter, you're building on top of that, which I can relate to that. I think it's a great way of looking at it. So really try and get a solid foundation and break your idea into chunks and make sure it's all about the details. That's what matters.
Fabulous. That's great advice, and I really appreciate, Ben. I've really enjoyed this discussion. You've a great story. I'm sure that you mentioned a book. I think there's a book in there somewhere. If only it were a life story book. I think there's an autobiography that would be a great seller because you've got some great insight, and there's much we can learn. And I really appreciate you taking the time out to share it with us this afternoon. And really appreciate your time, and great to be chatting with you.
My pleasure.
Great stuff. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thank you.
All the best. Cheers. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Extrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.